Welcome to Secure Software Development. Let's get started, as we always do, by discussing the governor of Massachusetts. There he is. And let's think about something that happened during his tenure as governor. So in 1990, the Group Insurance Commission of Massachusetts decided to release anonymized data on state employees. And this data showed every hospital visit, medicine, etc. The data was anonymized by removing the names, the addresses, and the social security numbers. So it was not possible to tie a particular piece of data back to a particular person because all the personally identifiable information had been removed from the health data. So it was perfectly safe to do this. And in fact, Governor Bill Weld assured everyone this was okay because, of course, it was okay. We'd taken the sensitive stuff out. And people aren't, how would you even get back to something like that? So now let's talk about LaTanya Sweeney. So she's a graduate student at the time, and she says, look at all this data. So she requests the data. And she knows some things. She knows Governor Weld lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 54,000 residents and 7 zip codes. And so then she spends the exorbitant sum of $20 to get the complete voter rolls from the city of Cambridge. This is public information. Has names, addresses, zip codes, birth dates, and sex. So she knows the governor. She knows his zip code. She knows he's male. Only 6 people in Cambridge shared the governor's birth date. And 3 of those 6 people, half, were men. Now she's down to 3. Only 1 lived in his zip code. Therefore, she extracted all those medical records and essentially sent the governor's medical records to his office, including all diagnostics and prescriptions. So this is the data had been de-identified. This is re-identification. And it turns out that anonymizing data, while still having that data maintain a lot of the structure that you need to do useful things with it, is hard. It's a hard problem. So she went on to graduate in spite of tangling with the governor. Now she's Dr. Sweeney. And she went on to show that 80% of all Americans could be uniquely identified using just 3 pieces of information: zip code, birthday, and sex. Once you have those 3 pieces of information, you can uniquely identify about 87% of all Americans. So there you go. Where are they today? Let's check in on them now. Dr. Sweeney is the Daniel Paul Professor of the Practice of Government and Technology at the Harvard Kennedy School and in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Government. Bill Weld was the last non-Donald Trump candidate to withdraw from the 2020 presidential election. He went on to support Joe Biden. There you go. So, a little bit of foreshadowing about data privacy. So before we get into data privacy, let's talk about online privacy. So we're going to want to distinguish privacy generally from what we would typically think of as online privacy. And often when you ask the question, is privacy important? Do people have privacy? People will think about online privacy and they'll be like, nah, we really don't, and it's not a big deal. Here, what we mean is online privacy as the ability to control who has access to data stored online, who can identify you online, or associate you with a particular account or with data. And that's certainly an important set of privacy concerns. But privacy very generally has more broad meaning. Does it matter? Should we take steps to protect privacy. And more significantly, since it's this class, should the software we write be designed to protect the privacy of the individuals who use the software? And by design, I mean that literally. Should we design in privacy mechanisms to the software? It's going to make the software more complex. It's going to add bugs. It's going to cause issues because we'll have to do hard things to preserve privacy. But should we do that? Is that worthwhile to even try? So let's talk about a company called Drizzly. Drizzly, it's hard to know from the name, but once you hear what it is, it's obvious. Drizzly sells alcohol. And here's part of their privacy policy. We maintain a number of administrative, physical, and technological measures. So administrative, right? We tell people, don't share data. Physical, we put your data in a locked drawer, and only Janet has the key. And technological, right? We keep it in a place where it's encrypted, maybe. Measures to protect the confidentiality, privacy, security of your personal information. These controls vary based on the nature of the information, right? If it's your credit card information, we'll take good care of that because that's the money part. If it's other information, maybe we'll be a little more loose with that because that's not as sensitive. Unfortunately, no website, server, or database is completely secure or hacker-proof, whatever that means. And we know that's true, right? We know that every system is vulnerable. So we can agree with them on that. We therefore cannot guarantee that personal information you provide will not be disclosed, misused, or lost by accident or by the unauthorized acts of others. Oopsie. If an oopsie happens, it's not our fault, right? You gave us the data. We did our best. We took all these administrative, physical, and technological measures to protect it. Oops. So in 2023, the Federal Trade Commission, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, finalized their order with Drizzly because they found that Drizzly failed to implement basic security measures, stored critical database information on an unsecured platform, and neglected to monitor security threats. Remember that administrative, physical, technical security? Yeah, they didn't do any of that. They said they did, and that's where the problem comes up. And the FTC didn't just go after Drizzly. They went specifically after the CEO, James Reyes, in the finding, has to implement information security programs at future companies. So this finding doesn't just apply to Drizzly. It also applies specifically to him and any companies that he creates if he moves to a business collecting consumer information from more than 25,000 individuals, which he almost certainly will if he has any kind of a business. So there you go. The whole press release is available there. It goes through the timeline and talks about why they had that finding. The FTC investigates alleged privacy violations, and it has shown it is willing to go after the executives of companies that don't take privacy seriously. Specifically, companies that say they take privacy seriously and then just don't do it. So there's some level, right? There's some level between I'm not doing anything and I tell you I'm not doing anything. Maybe that's okay. I'm doing a lot of stuff and I say I'm doing a lot of stuff. There's somewhere in the middle where it's like, yeah, I tell you I'm going to do these things, but then I don't do them. So the Federal Trade Commission can step in there to protect consumers. There's also legislation. We'll get to that in a little bit. So many states are trying to enact legislation to protect your privacy, in this case, online. The privacy landscape is changing constantly. Every year, as I update this little map, more states show up with legislation signed. Those are the green ones. You're in Tennessee. Tennessee has the color green on it, so you can tell that it's got some signed legislation. You can see New Jersey has legislation that's passed, but not signed at the time this was created on January 9th. And you can see that Kentucky and Missouri have legislation that's been introduced. Constantly changing. But there is a trend. You're like, well, how do I do? How do I run my company if this stuff is always in flux? Well, the legislation is trending toward requiring more of companies in terms of protecting privacy. So that's the trend, and that's the direction you should go. You should do responsible things to protect privacy. Sometimes that's pretty straightforward. Sometimes there are more things required of you. And it depends on a whole collection of privacy laws. And I've listed some of them on this slide. Do not think this is all of them. Do not think that this is only laws in the United States. In fact, the last one on this list, the General Data Protection Regulation, is an EU law. Why is it on this list? Because it absolutely applies to companies that want to do business in the EU. And if you have an online business, guess what? You want to do business in the EU. You also want to do business in Virginia. And Virginia has a Consumer Data Protection Act. You want to do business in California. And there's a couple on here from California, etc. So you have to take into account the privacy landscape as you're building out your software. Some of these are specific to particular kinds of data, right? If you have data about children, okay, now there's specific laws that apply to that. Do you have data about people's health information? Specific laws apply to that. Do you have data about students? Well, there are specific laws that apply to student data. They make us all go through training at Tech on it. So there's many different laws in place already. Some of them require that you do specific things in order to comply, and you have to take that into account. So what's going to bring the FTC down on you, right? It's not as complicated as you might think. If you engage in misleading or deceptive advertising practices, you're going to get them mad. If you make inaccurate privacy and security representations to customers, like Drizzly did, you're going to get them mad. Fail to implement and maintain reasonable data security measures, failure to abide by the organization's industry-agreed data security measures, failure to follow a published privacy policy, you're going to get them mad, right? If you disclose personal information in a manner that's not in the privacy policy, that will probably get them mad. That may not get you in deep trouble yet, but it's certainly on their radar. And violating consumer data privacy rights by collecting or sharing consumer information illegally, if you get caught doing that, that can get them mad. It may also break a whole bunch of other laws, so you should be a little careful. The privacy landscape's complicated and changing, right? You're going to need to respond to changes. Your software should be able to partition and protect sensitive information. Remember when we talked about partitioning your software so that you had personal information, name, address, phone number, perhaps in one database, linked with information in a completely different database that might be financial information or might be health information, right? The idea is I recognize that I may have evolving standards that I have to adhere to for different types of data. And so I should partition my data so that I can update my system as things evolve and change. You should be especially aware if your software will consume, store, or generate PII, right? Personally identifiable information. If you're running a business and doing almost anything, you certainly will. Protected health information. If you're working in the government sphere, will you be when you have controlled, unclassified information. What is that? That's government. It's information that the government has that is under some kind of controls, but it's not classified information. Classified information, we're not going to try to even begin to get into that here. That's got a whole other set of things that you have to do. Or if you have information about children, right? Keeping information about children in a database, you should be a little careful with that. So there was an attempt to create a comprehensive federal level Data Privacy Protection Act. So all the states are generating them, but we don't want 50, or maybe Chicago has its own and Houston has its own. So now we have more than 50. Right? We don't want that. We'd like to have some nice comprehensive set of standards at the top. And the American Data Privacy Protection Act was an attempt to do that. It failed to advance, but the provisions for it had significant bipartisan support. The votes on this in committee were almost unanimous. So while it didn't advance in the House and Senate, a lot of people liked what was in there. And so you can expect that kind of stuff to maybe find its way into bills that may come out later. The bill provided for private rights of action. Now, what does that mean? That means that it's not just a law which says, go do this or we'll fine you or punish you. This says if they do these things, you can sue them, right? There's a tort there, and you can sue them. And you can sue them for unauthorized access or disclosure of personal information, failure to implement reasonable measures to protect the information, collection of information without consent, sale of information without consent, and discrimination against consumers who exercise their privacy rights. So if you say, no, you can't sell my data, they're like, well, we won't do business with you. Okay, we got to figure that part out. So not a law yet, but probably parts of this are coming. Now, we've been talking about the legal aspects of this, but there's another aspect of it as well. There are people in the world who, through no fault of their own, right? If there's an accident of birth, they happen to be born in a particular place, to particular parents at a particular time, they're in serious danger if their privacy is breached. And there are people who are in serious danger if their privacy is breached because of their beliefs. Okay? There are lots of, we would like people to be their best selves. And psychologists tell us that to do that, you need to have your own private world. And if you can't do that, right, if you are living in a surveillance state, you won't be this self-actualizing person. Protecting the privacy of your users is your moral and your ethical duty as someone who creates a software system. Okay? But, of course, this is America. So, if you want to do the right thing, you need to provide incentives. And specifically, the incentives in the U.S. often take the form of money. So we have to ask the question, is there a business model that would promote protecting privacy? And if there is, great. All right, let's talk about data security. So data privacy and data security, are these two things the same thing? Well, data security says I'm going to protect your data from compromise by hackers and by malicious insiders. So I'm going to keep your data safe. Data privacy governs the method by which it's collected, shared, and used. Okay? So they're different things. They're different. Data security is distinct from data privacy. Just because I keep your data, in a lockbox doesn't mean I'm necessarily preserving your privacy. And if I'm preserving I may be trying to preserve your privacy, but I may be leaking data all the time. And believe it or not, that can happen. We'll talk about how that can happen when we discuss differential privacy. All right. Businesses, here we go with the whole line of what's the business model. Businesses have proprietary information. An example of this is the recipe for Coca-Cola's syrup, right? In case you don't know, coca comes from the coca plant, from which we get cocaine, and cola comes from the cola nut, from which they got caffeine, the wonderful punch of cocaine and caffeine that made up the original Coca-Cola. Perfect. Since then, of course, no more cocaine in there, and they've actually were ordered to reduce the amount of caffeine. Okay, still good stuff. This is data that derives at least part of its value from being protected against public access. Proprietary information ceases to be of value if everyone knows it. This could be inventions, it could be business processes, it could be planning information, strategic information, other things that you don't want competitors or maybe your regulators to know. And companies have a financial interest in keeping that information private. You might collect information from your customers or purchase information from other companies. In both cases, that information is now an asset, and you probably want to protect it, right? You spent money to get it, and you don't want to just give it away for free. Some companies do run services for free, and they may do so because this lets them collect data, which they can then monetize. So X is an example of that. X has a lot of information, and they turn it around, and they sell advertising on the platform. They can also license their data, they can license services, etc. But they run the basic service for free. Okay, so I'm going to claim reputational risk doesn't matter as much as we might like it to. You can be a company that's done a lot of terrible things and maybe has a bad reputation, and you're still going to be a company. I'm going to cite 3. Wells Fargo, which has had a number of scandals involving the way they've managed loans and data, etc. Adobe, number of problems. Most recently, people complaining about the new pricing model, but also constant problems with security. LinkedIn, right? These companies are still around. They're still doing quite well. Equifax is still around. The University of Phoenix, they're still around, right? All of these have had a bad reputation for various reasons, but they're still there. You can still play Star Wars Battlefront 2, even though there was many scandals surrounding loot boxes and microtransactions. None of that killed it. None of that killed any of this. Okay? But data is worth money. Companies want to protect their own data, even if they don't care about your data. All right? Data loss can harm their competitive advantages. Okay? Now, you may say, well, they had to protect my data because, as we've just talked about, there are laws, there's regulation. So, and yeah, there is, but I would point out that for large businesses or for industries that may have a strong trade coalition, they can typically address the regulatory constraints through regulatory capture. If you're not familiar with that, the basic idea is, where do regulators get people who know a lot about an industry? Well, probably from that industry. And then there is incentive when you're a regulator to play nice with the companies so that when you leave the regulatory agency, you could be hired by one of those companies and get a nice fishy job. And as long as that path, that sort of cyclical path is running, you can get away with a lot because you've basically captured your regulator. Okay? Doesn't always happen. Can't count on it. You're a little small company, you're probably not going to be able to do this. But it does happen, and it's something that people consciously invest time and energy in. There you go. Now, providing a single person's data online, that's a problem, right? It's a problem for that person, certainly, right? If a company doxes you, that's bad. But it's not necessarily going to get everyone's attention. Aggregated data, that's going to get their attention when you have a lot of data that I can then mine and see what I can discover from it. That's where things get interesting. And so one question arises here: what about web scraping? Right? Web scraping seems like massive data leaks, right? If I'm able to do web scraping of sites, I can build these big databases, train my models on it, and find out all kinds of stuff. Is that a problem? Well, to get there, let's talk about the case of HiQ and LinkedIn. That's from 2019, just prior to COVID. So on September 9th, the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that web scraping public sites does not violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. That was the act, remember, that they got Morris under. First person tried under that. Does not violate it. So what was happening here? The court basically legalized en masse web scraping, but it prohibited competitors from removing information from your site automatically if the site's public. Okay, what does all this mean? The court confirmed that a web scraper bot is just like a person running a web browser. Okay, they request open data and then do something with it on their side. Okay, the appeals court also upheld a ruling that prohibited LinkedIn from taking technological measures to interfere with web scraping on its site. Okay? So that, I think, is interesting. Now, this is American legislation, but basically the idea is that, hey, I can get to that data with my web browser, and I can automate the web browser, and it becomes a bot, and why not just throw the web browser away and just have the bot and just scrape your data? Okay, that's fine. You're making that data available. You can't now say, oh, you're not allowed to use it in this way. And this comes out of, again, everything has to boil back down to a business model. HiQ argued that LinkedIn's technical measures to block web scraping interfere with their contracts with their own customers. Malicious interference with a contract. There you go. We finally hit the money, and so now we can say something is or is not legal. Now, what doesn't happen is this decision doesn't grant the freedom to use data obtained by scraping for unlimited purposes. And an obvious example of that is, suppose I crawl YouTube, collect all the videos, and then set up my own video sharing site with all of YouTube's content. I can't do that, right? Because those videos are copyrighted. I still have to obey all the other laws about content as well. All right. Let's talk about individual privacy and about population data. So, suppose we want to build a data set of all the HIV positive individuals in the country. People might be concerned that you're building this data set, right? Because they might be concerned the information could become public and they could be discriminated against in a variety of ways. And so as we're building this data set, we now have the responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, we say, well, we're going to disallow queries on names. and will only return simple information computed from the data set. So you might ask, how many people who have been diagnosed with HIV live in Massachusetts? And we'll give you back an answer, give you a number. But this means we might do something like the following. We might say, how many people in the data set were born between January 1st, 1991 and February 1st, 1991, reside in Massachusetts, and have blood type B? If we know those things about, for example, Cezanne, we can figure out if he has been diagnosed because we can figure out if he's in the database. That breaks the privacy for him. Okay, if the answer comes back 1, we know he's present in the data even though we weren't able to ask about his name. Okay. Well, let's combat this by never returning a result that is less than some chosen number. Right? Let's say 100. If your query yields fewer than 100 records, we don't return it. Well, we can ask questions in such a way that we get a different collection of sets, and we're basically building the Venn diagram. And we can begin to determine if the intersection, which would contain the person we care about, is or is not empty. And we can begin to answer the question of whether or not a particular person is or is not present in the database. And that's a problem. That breaks the privacy again. And obviously, having this kind of a problem makes it difficult to put together the database in the first place. Is a database of everyone who has been diagnosed with a disease like HIV, is that useful? It turns out it's very useful for a lot of reasons, a lot of very practical reasons. But because of the risk, it's difficult to get people to agree to it. Okay? People may lie on surveys. They may request their data be removed, etc. And that takes us to the idea of statistical privacy. So, one of the problems we just discussed is non-cooperation. And Stanley Warner puts it like this in his seminal paper. For reasons of modesty, fear of being thought bigoted, or merely a reluctance to confide secrets to strangers, individuals attempt to evade certain questions put to them by interviewers. Basically, they become the non-cooperative group. They refuse outright to be surveyed. They provide wrong answers when they are surveyed. They just don't cooperate. And that's a problem for constructing surveys. Obviously, that's a problem. So how do we overcome this? Well, let's see. People decline to answer because of concerns that their answer could be used against them. Right? That's obviously a question of privacy. I'm concerned that if I answer truthfully, my answer will be used against me. So what if we could find a way to guarantee to you that your answer can't be linked to you? Right? We're going to guarantee the privacy of the individual surveyed. If we can do that and convince you that we can do that, you can answer truthfully and feel safe, and we'll get better data, and we can go on and do better things. The question is, how do we do this convincingly? So stop for a minute and try to think, how would you structure a survey to get answers from people, truthful answers from people, in such a way that they are confident their answer can't be linked back to them, that maybe there's deniability or there's a fundamental disconnection? How would you do that? So we're going to introduce an idea which we'll call the spinner. And here's the basic idea. Let's create a little hypothetical and see how this works. Suppose I want to know how common insider trading is, right? a lot of people doing it? Are a few people doing it? Well, it's illegal. I just go out there and I'm like, hey, I'm from the government. I'd like to know if you're engaging in this illegal activity. Well, sure, Mr. Government Man. Let me tell you, I'm definitely not. Right? So if I survey people, I can't expect honest answers in most cases because it's illegal. So what I do instead is I construct this magical device, which I'll call the spinner. It doesn't have to be a physical spinner. It can be randomized software. It can be a number of things. But basically, you see there's two regions. There's an A and a B. And A, in this case, is a little larger than B. So the probability when I spin it, I wind up in A, is a little higher than the probability that I end up in B. And if I don't wind up right on the line, right, if I just exclude those cases and make you spin again, I'm always going to end up either in A or B. And so the probability of A, let's say, is P, and the probability of B is 1 minus P. And I get to choose what P is by choosing the size of A and B, the relative sizes. So given this, I divide our population into two groups. Let's say group A is the people who have committed insider trading. They're guilty. Group B is the people who haven't. They're not guilty. I want to estimate this, but I need people to answer truthfully. So here's what I do. I give the participant the spinner. I'm like, here's a little spinner thing. I'm going to turn around. When I turn around, I want you to spin it. Okay? I want you to answer yes if the spinner lands on the group that you're in. Otherwise, answer no. Don't tell me where it lands. So I'll turn my back, you spin it, it lands in A, and you are in fact guilty, you say yes. It lands in B, and you're in fact not guilty, you say yes. So the yes doesn't necessarily convey to me whether you're guilty or not, just like a no doesn't convey to me whether you're guilty or not. Okay? This means that each participant has reasonable deniability. I turn my back, you spin it, and you say yes. You're like, aha, you're guilty. And you're like, no, it landed in the B region. Well, okay. So you answered correctly, and you're not guilty. Right? So this plot is reasonable deniability. Now, this depends on P, obviously, right? I mean, the extreme cases are pretty obvious, right? If P is 1, if the whole thing is group A, and you spin it, right, then I'm going to know, right? Because you're going to have to say yes or no. And then at that point, your incentive to lie is back. If P is 1/2, if I divide it perfectly evenly between A and B, then your answer doesn't really convey any information to me. The trick is when P is not, when it's somewhere between 1/2 and 1, it now conveys some information. Okay? It also has some deniability. So there are 4 possible outcomes to this. Right? I'm talking to an inside trader and the spinner lands in A, they say yes. Spinner lands in B, they say no. I'm talking to someone who's not an inside trader. Spinner lands in A, they say no. Spinner lands in B, they say yes. Now think about that for a minute. I know the probability P, so I can say that the proportion of the time that it lands in A, right, is this value P, and I know people saying yes or no, and so I know some portion of those yeses and nos are in that range. The question is, can I use all this information to estimate the population statistic of the probability of being an inside trader? I'm not saying can I figure out if a particular person is, because I really can't, but can I figure out what the statistic for the population is? So let's do the math. So we'll let pi be the true probability of A in the population. This is pi is the fraction of people who really are insider traders. P is the probability of A on the spinner, right? P is the probability of landing in the guilty zone. X sub I is the ith sample, and it's either a yes or a no. We'll assign it a 1 if it's yes, and a 0 if it's no. Now we can answer some questions, right? What is the probability that I get a yes? Well, there's 2 ways to do that. I'm in the guilty group and the spinner lands in the guilty group. That would be pi times p, because those things have to be jointly true. It's also the case that the spinner might land in the not guilty group, right? And that happens with 1 minus p. But then I would also have to be not guilty in order to say yes. And so that would be 1 minus pi. And so I have the 1 minus pi, 1 minus p joint probability. Those are independent outcomes, right? Either I'm guilty or I'm not. I can't be both, we hope. So we can add those together. We do the same thing for 0. We wind up with the 4 outcomes, which represent which are represented by the 4 terms there. And that gives us the probability associated with each one of these. We can then talk about things like likelihood. Okay? The likelihood is the joint probability that all the observed data we see, okay, it's the joint probability of the observed data viewed as a function of the parameters of the statistical model, right? So we can say, how likely is this particular outcome given a particular value of pi? So I say, I believe that the true percentage of people in the population who are guilty is 20%. Given that I think that's true, I can now look at my data and I can say, how likely is it that given that the true proportion is 20%, I would see this outcome? And I can actually compute that. And that's the equation for it there on the slide. So that equation, the likelihood, L, depends on some choice of pi. The neat thing about this is, right, so I might try a value of pi and find out the likelihood is low. I might try another value of pi, maybe it's a little higher. And I might try another value of pi, maybe it's a little higher, so I can maybe hill climb and I can get there. The point is, I can choose, right? If this is a convex function, turns out it is, I can choose a pi such that the likelihood is maximized, right? So in other words, now I've turned the situation around. I've said, based on what I saw from my samples, this is the most likely value for pi to explain that observation. So the more observations I have, clearly the better I'm going to do. And I'm going to get a pi that's the one that's the most likely to be able to explain that set of observations. That is a maximum likelihood estimator. It's a really amazing and wonderful concept. And it turns out with a little calculus, we can figure it out, right? So let's go back to the slide. You want to go ahead and figure out where the maximum is on that. So you'll want to take a derivative. You want to set it equal to 0 to get inflection points. You'll want to look at the ends. As you do all that work, you'll wind up with something that looks a little bit like this. So here's our maximum likelihood estimator for pi. And you'll notice a bunch of things in here. P, we know, that's our probability. N, we know, that's the number of pieces of data, right? And notice that the denominator has a 2p minus 1 in it. What if p is 1/2? If p is 1/2, 2 times a half is 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. Oops, we have a problem, right? I can't give you a maximum likelihood estimate of pi when p is 1/2. And we already knew that P being 1/2 conveyed no information, and now we see that as a consequence in the math itself. If you want to know the variance of this estimator, it's the variance of the sample plus the variance associated with the spinner itself. Okay, let's apply this to see what's going on. Suppose we have a sample of 1,000 people, one of which is an inside trader. So we know some stuff. We know that pi is 0.001, right? 1 in 1,000. We know that P is 0.75 because we can choose that. We get to pick that part. And so we then ask 1,000 people. And we would expect, if the spinner is fair, that about 750 times, probably not exactly, but about 750 times, the spinner lands on A. And about 250 times, the spinner lands on B. It's going to be about 3 to 1. Okay? And most respondents will answer no when it lands on A, and most will answer yes when it lands on B, except for our inside trader. They will do the opposite, right? They're going to answer yes when it's on A and no when it's on B. And so that's going to skew our results just a little bit, potentially. So suppose the spinner lands on A for our insider, we wind up with 251 yeses and 749 no's. Okay? Based on this, we plug in, we find out that our estimator for pi is 2 out of 1,000. It's not exactly correct. It's an estimate. But man, is it pretty close. The important thing is that we have no way to discover the insider from all the data we have. We have this pile of data, but we can't. Data would seem to indicate that there's likely to be at least one, maybe two insiders in the population, but we can't say who they are, right? The insider's anonymity and their privacy is preserved. So another question we have is, how many samples do I need? What's my stopping criteria? And that's going to depend on the variance. Okay? More samples will be needed the closer P is to 1/2, right? So I would like to push P away from 1/2 and make it larger than that. But all of this is pushing us in the direction of a mathematical framework. Now, all of this is covered in Warner's paper, and it's great. This is all gives us a nice framework for doing this kind of stuff. So let's see what else we can do with this model. Now, suppose we decide to reverse the process. So here's what we do. Instead of collecting data that we think is sensitive and people will lie about it, we collect information, let's say, directly from the hospital. So we have information that we believe is highly reliable. We're going to put it in a database. We're concerned about leaking secrets out of it. So what we do is, whenever someone generates a query, we spin our little spinner, and if the spinner matches the answer, we respond yes, and if it doesn't, we respond no. So we are now using the spinner to add noise to data as it's coming out of the system instead of as it's going in. And again, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to create plausible deniability. But you can play the same game. People on the outside who are observing the results of this process can use a maximum likelihood estimator to estimate a population statistic, but not to get a particular person's data. So we have two models. Data is coming in, we add noise to the data, and then the data in the database has noise built into it. It has deniability built into it. If the database leaks, so what? Right? So what? The data looks the same whether a particular individual is included or not. I can't distinguish, right? So let's say, is Joe in the data? Well, if Joe were in the data, it would look like it does, I guess. And if he weren't there, it would still look like it does, right? Because of the noise we've added. It's impossible to determine if a particular person is present. We can also add noise when we remove information. So here, the data has the true information in it. We have to trust the database maintainer to take care of that. And then we add noise when there is a query. And again, the query should not let me determine if a specific individual is included in the set. All right. This homework, let's do it 1 week. And the homework is to apply some of this. So your company decides to conduct a survey, and they're going to ask employees whether they've ever stolen from the company. That's probably something you want to be a little careful about how you respond to if you've actually been stealing stuff from the company. So to protect employees' privacy, sure, but mainly to encourage truthful responses so they can get an actual accurate measure, the company uses the spinner model to provide the employees surveyed with plausible deniability. Each employee is given a spinner, and there are 3, in this case, possible outcomes: yes, no, and the truth. And they'll each take up about 1/3 of the spinner. If the spinner lands on yes, you say yes. If it lands on no, you say no. If it lands on truth, you say whether you've ever stolen or not. You just say yes or no. But we don't know what a yes or no means, and we're going to get yeses and nos both because they're on the little spinner. So after we collect responses from 300 employees, the company reports that 40% of the responses were yes. So purely randomly, let's assume no one has stolen and that the spins are all purely random. About 1/3 of the time, I would land on yes. About 1/3 of the time, I would land on no. And about 1/3 of the time, I would land on truth, and the people would say no because they've never stolen. That means that I would expect to get about 33% yes. But I don't get 33% yes, I get 40% yes. So it feels like there's something going on there where maybe there are some people who've stolen from the company. Great. Your task is to calculate the estimated true proportion of employees who have violated company policy. Okay? Pi will be the true proportion, and you can use the observed proportion of 40% to estimate it. This might be a little tricky, so send me questions when you have them. Show your work, and submit it in a PDF. And you can scan, take photos of handwritten notes or whatever, but please turn it into a PDF at the end that is possible for me to read and submit it. And that's it.